The last morning of Carthage does not begin with silence. It begins with smoke rising from a harbour that once held the richest ships of the western Mediterranean, with broken rooftops glowing red in the heat, with narrow streets turned into passages of ash, and with Roman soldiers moving through a city that had refused to die for 3 years longer than many in Rome expected. Somewhere beyond the fires are the double harbours, the commercial basin where merchant vessels had once unloaded ivory, silver, grain, purple cloth, and strange goods from the edges of the known world, and the circular military harbour hidden and disciplined where warships had once rested like a secret blade. By the time Rome finally takes the city in 146 BCE, those harbours no longer represent trade or naval genius. To Roman eyes they represent memory, they represent Hannibal, they represent invasion, humiliation, and the terrifying thought that a rival power might rise again if even a fragment of its strength is allowed to survive. Carthage is not destroyed because it is weak. It is destroyed because in Roman imagination it has been too strong for too long. That is the strange heart of the story. Empires often crush enemies for wealth, land revenge, or pride, and Rome has all of these motives in abundance. But with Carthage, something colder and deeper is at work. Rome has already beaten Carthage before. It has taken its fleet, its empire in Spain, its war elephants, its right to wage war without Roman permission. It has forced the city to pay heavy indemnities and accept the shadow of Roman supervision. By ordinary measures, Carthage should no longer be an existential threat. Yet in Rome, generation after generation, the name still carries the weight of disaster. The evidence remains incomplete because the Carthaginian side of the story was largely buried beneath Roman victory, but what survives in the record suggests that fear did not end when the wars were won. It hardened, it became policy. To understand why Rome erased Carthage, it is necessary to stand inside a Roman mind scarred by the Second Punic War. For Romans who grew up hearing family stories of Hannibal in Italy, Carthage was not simply another defeated city across the sea. It was the enemy that had crossed the Alps with elephant-shattered Roman armies, killed tens of thousands of citizens and allies, and made Rome feel perhaps for the first time that its destiny could be cut short. The memory of that danger did not fade cleanly. It settled into speeches, rituals, political arguments, and the instincts of senators who knew that power is never safe, while a rival has wealth, walls, ships, and a past full of impossible recoveries. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The ruins themselves tell a quieter story than the Roman speeches do. Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa in what is now Tunisia, on a superb position overlooking the central Mediterranean. Its location was not accidental. It faced sea routes connecting Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, Italy, and the Levant. It could watch trade tacks and intervene. Long before Roman power reached across the water, Carthage had been a city of merchants, sailors, farmers, aristocrats, craftsmen, soldiers, priests, and enslaved labourers, woven into a network that stretched farther than most inland peoples could imagine. It was not a vague barbarian threat, as hostile Roman tradition often implied. It was a sophisticated urban civilization, with deep Phoenician roots, a powerful merchant elite, and an ability to convert maritime skill into political influence. That is part of what made it so frightening. Rome understood conquest through roads, colonies, infantry, land oaths, and discipline. Carthage understood power through ports, contracts, naval bases, tribute-hired soldiers, and sea lanes. The two cities did not merely compete for territory. They represented different ways of controlling the world. Rome could defeat armies and absorb communities into its expanding system. Carthage could appear wherever ships could go, drawing wealth from mines in Spain, farms in Africa, and trade routes that crossed the Mediterranean like invisible threads. Scholars still debate how ordinary Carthaginians understood their own empire, because so little Punic writing survives compared with Greek and Roman accounts. But Rome clearly understood one thing: a maritime commercial power, even when wounded, might recover faster than expected. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage looks beaten but not dead. That is exactly the problem. Its old overseas empire is gone, yet its African hinterland remains fertile. Its merchants are active, its population is large, its workshops and farms still produce wealth. It pays off its war indemnity earlier than Rome expects, a detail that seems almost mundane until one imagines how it sounds in the Senate. A city supposedly broken by defeat is suddenly solvent. A city stripped of empire is still rich. A city that once nearly brought Rome to ruin is not behaving like a corpse. In Roman politics, this becomes intolerable. The famous images of an elderly senator holding up a fresh fig said to have come from land near Carthage, showing how close, fertile, and dangerous the city remains. Whether every detail of that story is exactly true is uncertain. Ancient anecdotes often sharpen memory into theatre. But the meaning survives because it captures Rome's anxiety perfectly. Carthage is near. Carthage is productive. Carthage is not finished. And for men who believe that security depends on removing threats before they return, this is enough. Yet fear alone does not explain everything. Rome also wants control of the Western Mediterranean. It wants no rival centre of wealth on the African coast. It wants to reward allies, punish defiance, and make an example so severe that other states understand what happens when they resist Roman will for too long. Fear and ambition are not opposites here. They feed each other. The Roman Republic is becoming something larger than a city-state, though it does not yet fully admit what it is becoming. It defeats kingdoms, arbitrates disputes, takes hostages, redraws borders, and insists that peace exists only on Roman terms. Carthage, even weakened, remains a reminder that another kind of great power once stood in the same sea. The destruction that follows is therefore not a sudden act of rage. It is the final movement of a long psychological and strategic struggle. Rome first fears Carthage as a rival, then it fears Carthage as an invader, then it fears Carthage as a memory that might become real again. By the time Roman armies arrive for the Third Punic War, the question is no longer whether Carthage has actually rebuilt the empire of Hannibal. It has not. The question is whether Rome can tolerate even the possibility that it might. This is what makes the story so unsettling. Great powers often claim that their most extreme actions are forced upon them by necessity. They speak of defense while expanding of security, while demanding obedience of peace while preparing destruction. In Carthage, Rome sees not simply an enemy city but a future nightmare. And so the Roman answer is not to watch it weaken it or humble it again. The answer is to remove it from history as a living power. But before Carthage becomes ruins, before its name turns into a warning whispered through later centuries, it is a city alive with confidence, skill, wealth, and ambition. To see why Rome feared it so deeply, the story has to move backward from the ashes across the sea toward the centuries when two cities were still rising, each shaped by a different landscape, each learning to measure power in its own way, and neither yet knowing that the Mediterranean was not wide enough for both. Rome and Carthage face the same sea, but they do not grow from the same imagination. One begins inland among hills, fields, cattle tracks, river crossings, and neighbouring communities bound by oath, suspicion, marriage, and war. The other rises from the coast open to wind sailcloth foreign languages and the constant arrival of ships. Rome looks at the world first through land. Carthage looks at it first through water. This difference seems simple, almost geographical, Yet it shapes everything that follows because cities do not merely occupy landscapes, they absorb them. They turn rivers, harbours, mountains, and roads into habits of thought. Rome's early world is narrow compared with Carthage's. The city grows beside the Tiber, not on the open sea, but near enough to reach it. Its people live in a hard, competitive region, where small communities become dangerous neighbours, and survival depends on discipline alliances and a willingness to fight again after defeat. What survives in the record suggests that early Rome's rise is not smooth or inevitable. It is rough, local, and often precarious. Romans learned to expand by incorporating defeated peoples, demanding soldiers, building roads, planting colonies, and turning former enemies into parts of a larger war machine. This is one of Rome's most important inventions. It does not only conquer men, it teaches many of them to become Roman enough to fight for Rome. Carthage's beginning is different. It is a daughter of the Phoenician world tied to seafaring peoples from the eastern Mediterranean, who had long carried goods, alphabets, gods, and techniques across the water. Tradition places its foundation in the late 9th century BCE, though scholars still debate the exact details of its earlier settlement and how much later storytelling reshaped the memory of its origins. From the beginning, Carthage belongs to a wider maritime network. Its power does not depend on marching outward in every direction. It depends on holding points of connection, harbours, islands, trading stations, coastal territories, and routes between them. Where Rome sees a frontier to be subdued, Carthage sees a route to be managed. This does not mean Carthage is peaceful or merely commercial. Trade and violence are never far apart in the ancient Mediterranean. A port that handles silver and grain must protect them. A merchant city with colonies and interests abroad must make treaties, hire soldiers, punish rivals, and sometimes fight hard. But Carthage often uses a different system from Rome. Its armies include Libyans, Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, and others led by Carthaginian commanders, but drawn from many peoples. Its fleets are central to its power. Its aristocrats are wealthy from land and trade. Its influence spreads in a pattern less like a single block of territory and more like a chain of strong points and obligations. To Rome, that pattern can look slippery. A land empire can be mapped with roads and borders. A maritime empire can seem to vanish and reappear. Carthaginian strength lies in motion. Ships leave at dawn and return with goods from places most Romans will never see. Messages pass from harbour to harbour. Commanders recruit beyond the horizon. Wealth gathers without always looking like conquest. This is a lesser-known but crucial detail. Carthage's African agriculture may have been as important to its wealth as its sea trade. The land around the city and deeper into its hinterland was fertile, carefully managed and productive. Later, Roman authors admired Punic farming knowledge enough that after Carthage fell, a Carthaginian agricultural treatise associated with Mago was reportedly translated for Roman use. Rome destroyed the city, but it preserved the farming wisdom of the enemy it had erased. History has a dry sense of irony. For centuries before their rivalry becomes fatal, Rome and Carthage do not have to be enemies. In fact, early treaties suggest recognition boundaries and practical diplomacy. Each understands that the other matters. Carthage is already a great maritime power when Rome is still consolidating Italy. Rome is not yet the master of the Mediterranean. It is a strong Italian state among other strong Italian and Greek powers. Carthage has interests in Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Spain. Rome's concerns are closer to home. The two cities can afford caution because their ambitions have not yet fully collided. But geography is patient. It waits for growing powers to reach the same doorway. That doorway is Sicily. The island lies between Italy and North Africa, a stepping stone, a granary, a prize, and a trap. Greek cities, local peoples, tyrants, mercenaries, Carthaginian forces, and eventually Roman armies all struggle over it. Whoever controls Sicily can threaten the sea between Rome and Carthage. Whoever loses influence there risks being watched from too close a distance. Sicily turns the Mediterranean from a wide space into a crowded room. Rome's expansion through Italy changes the balance. Once Rome dominates the peninsula, it becomes impossible for it to ignore what lies just across the strait. Its southern cities are tied to Greek culture and maritime politics. Its allies have interests beyond the mainland. Its security now reaches toward the coast. Carthage, meanwhile, cannot treat Roman power as just another inland concern. Rome has become a state with manpower on a scale that Carthage cannot easily match. The two powers are not natural enemies in some mystical sense, but their systems are beginning to press against each other. No single explanation fully accounts for why rivalry turned into total war. Yet the structure of the problem is clear. One power controls the Western Sea, the other has mastered Italy, and Sicily lies between them like a loaded blade. The contrast between them also feeds misunderstanding. Rome prides itself on endurance citizen armies, ancestral custom, and the moral language of duty. Carthage in Roman descriptions often appears wealthy, cunning, foreign, and untrustworthy. These descriptions are not neutral. They come mostly from Greek and Roman voices, many of them hostile, and the evidence remains incomplete because Carthaginian literature and political self-description were largely lost. But hostile images matter because they shape decisions. Romans do not simply see Carthaginians as competitors. Over time they learn to see them as a different kind of danger, one that cannot be trusted to remain beaten. Carthage likely sees Rome with its own unease. Here is a city that absorbs defeat with unnerving discipline, that can lose armies and raise new ones, that turns allies into reserves of manpower, that does not seem to understand when a war should become too costly to continue. Against Greek cities or rival kings, negotiation payment and limited settlements might restore balance. Against Rome, balance becomes harder. Rome's strength is not brilliance at sea or ancient commercial reach. Its strength is persistence. It can be clumsy, slow to adapt, and politically divided, but it keeps coming. So the future war is already forming before the first great clash begins. It forms in the gap between land power and sea power, between citizen manpower and hired armies, between roads and harbours, between Roman fear of encirclement and Carthaginian fear of being pushed from the central Mediterranean. It forms because both cities can imagine themselves secure only if the other is kept at a distance. And once Rome learns to cross the water, distance itself begins to disappear. The tragedy is that neither city begins with a plan to fight for more than a century. There is no single moment when some ancient statesman looks across the sea and decides that one civilization must be destroyed. Instead, small decisions gather force. A dispute in Sicily, a request for help, a calculation that intervention will be limited, a belief that the enemy will back down. The Mediterranean is full of such mistakes. Carthage has ships' wealth and experience. Rome has manpower, discipline, and an astonishing ability to turn crisis into expansion. When these two systems finally collide, Rome will learn something it never forgets. The sea is not just a boundary. It is a road by which fear can travel. Before Rome's shadow stretches across the sea, Carthage is already old in the way that maritime cities become old, not only by years but by roots, habits, inherited bargains, and names repeated in harbours far from home. Its story begins with Phoenician sailors from the eastern Mediterranean people, whose cities such as Tyre and Sidon had long lived between land empires and the open sea. They were not conquerors in the Roman sense, driving roads across continents and enrolling defeated peoples into armies. They were navigators, traders, settlers, craftsmen and survivors, building networks where ships could carry what armies could not. From that world came the seeds of Carthage, planted on the North African coast in a place so well chosen that geography itself seemed to argue for greatness. The site offered what a seaborne power needed most. It had access to fertile land, a commanding position near central Mediterranean routes and harbours that could be defended and improved. A city there could look east toward old Phoenician connections, north towards Sicily and Italy, west toward Sardinia, Iberia, and the Atlantic approaches, and south into the African interior. It could gather grain metals, timber animals, textiles, and human labour. It could become a meeting point for worlds that rarely saw each other directly. What survives in the record suggests that Carthage grew not as a lonely colony, but as a leader among Western Phoenician communities, especially as older Eastern centres came under pressure from larger empires. As Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and later Hellenistic powers reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean, Carthage's position in the West became more important. Its identity was Punic, a Western continuation and transformation of Phoenician culture. The language written in a Semitic script linked Carthage to its Eastern ancestors, but the city was not a mere copy of Tyre. It became something distinct, African and Mediterranean at once. Its gods, rituals, names, and political institutions carried older patterns into a new environment. Its elites developed estates in the countryside. Its merchants handled wide trade. Its ships moved through waters that could be profitable one season and deadly the next. Carthage was not a romantic city of pure commerce. No ancient power that wealthy could afford innocence. It negotiated, coerced, colonized, taxed, fought, and exploited. Yet it did so through a system that looked very different from Rome's later empire. The city's wealth came from many directions. There were agricultural estates in North Africa producing grain, olives, wine, and other goods, in a landscape far richer than later stereotypes of desert Africa suggest. There were trade routes into the interior where ivory hides metals and perhaps enslaved people moved northward. There were connections with Sardinia, Sicily, the Balearic Islands, and especially southern Iberia, where silver and other resources mattered enormously. Carthaginian ships may have travelled beyond the Pillars of Heracles into the Atlantic, though the details are difficult to separate from later Greek and Roman fascination. Accounts of distant voyages, including the famous tradition of Hanno's expedition along the African coast, survive through Greek transmission, and scholars still debate how much of the text reflects accurate navigation, literary shaping, or both. Even uncertainty tells us something. Carthage was imagined by admirers and enemies alike, as a city whose reach extended beyond familiar horizons. At the centre of this power stood the harbour. Later descriptions of Carthage's Cothon, especially the circular military harbour, have captured imaginations for centuries. An inner basin with ship sheds arranged around it, a central island for command and access controlled from the sea. Archaeology has confirmed the basic reality of the harbour complex, though details of its exact appearance and use remain debated. It was not just a place to park ships, it was infrastructure as strategy. It allowed Carthage to build, maintain, conceal, and deploy naval force. A merchant city without warships is prey. Carthage understood this clearly. Its navy protected trade and projected power long before Rome had any serious tradition of naval warfare. The political life of Carthage is harder to reconstruct because the sources are uneven and often hostile. Greek writers compared its constitution favourably, at times noting a balance of aristocratic councils, magistrates often called suffets, and some role for popular assemblies. But these descriptions are filtered through Greek categories and Roman-era interests. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for how Carthaginian politics functioned in daily practice. Still, Carthage seems to have been ruled by wealthy families and councils, with commanders gaining influence through military success abroad. This created a world where trade landholding politics and war overlapped. Ambitious families could build power in Spain or Sicily, while the city itself remained cautious, calculating, and sometimes divided. Religion added another layer to Roman suspicion. Carthage worshipped deities such as Baal-Hamon and Tanit, and archaeological discoveries of urns containing cremated remains of infants and animals in sacred precincts have fueled one of the most controversial debates in ancient history. Greek and Roman writers accused Carthaginians of child sacrifice, and some modern scholars argue that the archaeological evidence supports ritual killing in certain cases. Others caution that hostile literary testimony, burial practices, disease, infant mortality, and ritual commemoration complicate the picture. It is a subject where certainty is difficult, and the moral charge is immense. For Rome, however, the accusation served a political purpose. It made Carthage not only a rival, but an alien and frightening one, a city that could be imagined as wealthy, secretive, and morally corrupted. Whether Roman audiences understood the nuance is doubtful. Enemy images rarely leave room for nuance. Yet if we strip away Roman fear and later legend, Carthage appears as a remarkable civilization. Its craftsmen worked metal, ivory, textiles, ceramics, and glass. Its merchants used weights, measures, contracts, and credit systems suited to long-distance exchange. Its farmers developed techniques admired even by conquerors. Its sailors navigated by stars, coasts, winds, and inherited knowledge. Its armies, though often made up of diverse forces, could be formidable when led well. Its generals understood terrain diplomacy and the value of alliances. In Sicily, Carthage faced Greek powers for generations, fighting wars that were brutal, expensive, and inconclusive. These conflicts taught Carthage how to operate in contested borderlands, how to use fortresses and fleets, and how to endure setbacks without surrendering its wider position. That endurance matters. Rome later convinces itself that Carthage is dangerous because it might recover, but Carthage's history had already shown a pattern of recovery. It loses battles and returns. It suffers political strains and continues. It competes with Greeks, manages African subjects, expands in Iberia, and adapts to changing conditions. The city is not invincible, but it is resilient. For a rising Rome, this resilience will become disturbing. A defeated enemy that cannot be trusted to remain defeated is more frightening than an enemy that simply wins. Carthage's power also rests on a paradox. It is outward-looking yet deeply protective of its own central city. It depends on foreigners yet remains governed by its Punic elite. It hires many soldiers yet must ensure their loyalty through pay command and success. This system can produce flexibility but also danger. Mercenary armies can be effective, but if unpaid or alienated, they can turn savage. After the First Punic War, Carthage will learn this with horror during the Mercenary War, when its own former troops and African subjects rebel in a conflict so brutal that ancient writers remembered it as almost uniquely cruel. But before that catastrophe, the system still seems powerful. Carthage can place armies in Sicily, command fleets, draw wealth from trade, and hold a sphere of influence that Rome cannot ignore. In its confident centuries, Carthage does not look like a doomed city. It looks like a city built for survival. Its people live in a world of temples, markets, docks, courtyards, warehouses, workshops, aristocratic houses, and crowded streets where many languages may have been heard. Ships arrive with news before armies do. The sea brings danger, but also life. To the north, Sicily remains a contested prize. To the east, the old Phoenician homeland becomes increasingly entangled with great empires. To the west, Iberia offers wealth beyond calculation. And across the water, a land power on the Tiber is growing slowly at first, then with a speed that will force every old power in the region to reconsider what Rome is. Carthage before Rome's shadow is therefore not a minor prelude. It is the reason the later fear becomes possible. Rome does not destroy an empty symbol. It destroys a civilization with memory, wealth, institutions, technical skill, sacred traditions, and a record of returning from danger. When Roman senators later argue that Carthage must be removed, they are not reacting only to what the city is in that moment. They are reacting to what it has been, what it has survived, and what they believe it might become again. Long before Hannibal crosses the Alps, Carthage has already taught the Mediterranean that power can float, trade can become empire, and a city on the sea can shape the fate of lands it never fully occupies. Rome does not become a naval power because it wants to admire the sea. It becomes a naval power because Carthage leaves it no comfortable alternative. For generations, the Romans have understood war through marching columns, fortified camps, fields of infantry, allied contingents, and the stubborn pressure of land campaigns. The sea is useful, dangerous and necessary, but it is not yet the natural stage of Roman greatness. Carthage, by contrast, has lived with ships for centuries. Its sailors know winds, harbours, currents, coastal approaches, and the discipline of fleets. When the struggle over Sicily becomes impossible to contain, Rome is forced into an unfamiliar element, and that forced education changes its history forever. The First Punic War begins not as a grand ideological war between civilizations, but from a messy Sicilian crisis involving mercenaries, local power, and rival interventions. That is often how enormous wars begin, not with clarity, but with a dispute that each side believes it can manage. Rome crosses into Sicily, and suddenly the old boundary between Italian land power and Carthaginian sea power no longer holds. Carthage cannot allow Rome to dominate the island. Rome cannot allow Carthage to sit so close to Italy with unchecked influence. What had been a regional problem becomes a contest over who will command the central Mediterranean. At first, Rome is at a disadvantage. Carthage has the fleet, the experience, and the habits of maritime war. Rome has manpower, discipline, and an alarming willingness to improvise. Ancient tradition claims that the Romans copied the design of a captured Carthaginian warship, using it as a model to build their own fleet. The story may be simplified, as such stories often are, but its meaning is true enough. Rome learns by necessity. It does not need to love naval warfare to understand that it must master it, or lose. In a remarkably short time, the Republic constructs fleets on a scale that would have seemed unlikely for an inland-minded Italian power. Timber labour, money, training, and political will are forced into one immense project. The Romans also invent or adopt a device that reveals their mindset, the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that could drop onto an enemy deck and turn a naval encounter into something more like a land battle. Scholars still debate how widely and effectively it was used, and whether it contributed to later ship instability and storms, but the idea is beautifully Roman. If the sea refuses to become land, Rome will make a small piece of land fall onto the sea. Naval manoeuvre, ramming skill, and seamanship matter less when Roman infantry can board and fight hand to hand. Against Carthaginian crews accustomed to more traditional naval tactics, this changes the equation. Rome does not defeat Carthage at sea by becoming Carthage. It defeats Carthage, at least at moments, by dragging the battle into Roman terms. Yet the cost is horrifying. The First Punic War lasts more than 2 decades, from 264 to 241 BCE. and becomes one of the longest continuous wars Rome has ever fought up to that point. It is not a clean march of victories. Fleets are wrecked by storms. Thousands drown not in glorious combat, but in weather-poor seamanship, bad luck, and the unforgiving physics of overloaded warships. Armies struggle in Sicily's rugged terrain, where cities, fortresses, mountains, and supply lines make every gain expensive. Carthage holds on stubbornly, especially in western Sicily, and Roman determination is tested again and again. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, but what survives suggests a war of exhaustion, adaptation, and repeated rebuilding. One of the surprising features of this war is how often Rome loses and continues. A wealthy aristocracy and a broad alliance system allow it to replace ships, raise crews, and absorb costs that might have broken another state. Carthage too endures, but its system is different. It relies heavily on naval professionalism, money, and commanders operating far from the home city. Rome can draw more directly on citizen and allied manpower. In a long war of attrition, that difference matters. The Roman state is not richer in the same way Carthage is rich, but it can mobilize people with extraordinary force. Every disaster becomes a reason to build again. Carthage also learns things about Rome. It learns that Rome is not easily discouraged. It learns that Roman defeat is not the same as Roman collapse. It learns that a state once confined to Italy can build fleets, invade islands, and threaten Carthaginian interests beyond the mainland. For Carthage, this must be deeply unsettling. Rome has crossed a psychological threshold. It is no longer only a land power that can be contained on the peninsula. It is learning to project force across water, and once Rome learns a military lesson, it rarely forgets it. The war eventually turns through naval exhaustion and financial strain. Rome, after losses and delays, builds yet another fleet, reportedly with private contributions from wealthy citizens, a detail that reveals both desperation and commitment. In 241 BCE, at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, the Roman fleet defeats the Carthaginians and cuts the logic of resistance. Carthage cannot supply its forces in Sicily effectively. It asks for peace. Rome demands Sicily an indemnity and recognition of Roman victory. For the first time, Carthage loses a major overseas possession to Rome. For the first time, Rome gains a province beyond Italy. This is a turning point larger than it may seem. Rome has discovered that victory can exist across the sea. Sicily becomes not merely conquered territory, but a school of empire. Administering an island, collecting revenue, managing local communities, and maintaining strategic control force Rome into new habits. The Republic begins to develop the tools of provincial rule. Carthage, meanwhile, is wounded not only in pride but in structure. Its Sicilian commitments are gone, its treasury strained, its soldiers unpaid or dissatisfied, and its authority over former troops and African subjects weakened. The aftermath is brutal. Carthage soon faces the mercenary war, sometimes called the Truceless War, a revolt by unpaid mercenaries and resentful subject communities. Ancient accounts emphasize its savagery, and even if the rhetoric is heightened, the conflict appears to have been truly desperate. Carthage fights not a foreign rival, but men who know its methods, its weaknesses, and its dependence on hired force. Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal, emerges as one of the commanders who help save the city. But while Carthage struggles, Rome watches and intervenes opportunistically, taking Sardinia and Corsica and imposing additional demands. To Carthaginian eyes, this must have looked less like peace than predation. To Roman eyes, it may have seemed like prudent security. No single explanation fully accounts for the bitterness that follows, but the seed of the next war is planted here. The First Punic War teaches Rome to fear the sea but also to use it. It teaches Rome that Carthage is dangerous because its power can survive for decades, and because its fleets can turn distant islands into shields or daggers. It teaches Rome that maritime conflict is expensive, unpredictable, and deadly, yet also essential. Most importantly, it teaches Rome that Carthage can be beaten but not cheaply and not finally. The victory of 241 BCE does not produce trust, it produces suspicion. If such a long war was required to remove Carthage from Sicily, what might be required if Carthage rebuilt elsewhere? Carthage's answer is Spain. Under Hamilcar and then his successors, Carthaginian power shifts westward into Iberia, where silver manpower and new military opportunities offer a path out of humiliation. Rome may have taken Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, but Carthage is not finished. It is transforming. Its old sea empire has been damaged, yet a new land-based military empire begins to take shape in the west, under a family with a long memory and a private hatred sharpened by defeat. Among that family's children is a boy who will grow into the most frightening enemy Rome ever faces. The First Punic War teaches Rome to cross the sea. The next war will teach Rome what it means for fear to cross the mountains. Hannibal does not enter Roman memory as an ordinary enemy. He enters it as a wound that refuses to close. By the time he becomes commander in Spain, the rivalry between Rome and Carthage has already passed through humiliation, opportunism, and revenge. Carthage has lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. It has survived revolt. It has turned toward Iberia, where silver mines, fortified towns, local alliances, and hard campaigning give the Barcid family a new foundation of power. Rome watches this rise with suspicion, but suspicion is not yet panic. That comes later when Hannibal decides that Rome's strength must not be attacked at its edges, but at its heart. The road to the Second Punic War runs through Saguntum, a city in eastern Spain, whose status and alliances become the spark for catastrophe. Ancient sources disagree in details, and scholars still debate how far Rome's commitments extended, how deliberately Hannibal provoked war, and whether either side fully understood what it was unleashing. What is clear is that the siege and fall of Saguntum gives Rome a cause, or at least a powerful argument for war. Rome expects perhaps a struggle in Spain or Africa. Hannibal offers something different. He brings the war into Italy. The crossing of the Alps has become one of those historical images so famous that it almost stops feeling real elephants moving through snow soldiers, clinging to icy paths, mountain tribes attacking from above men and animals, lost to cold hunger rock and exhaustion. The details are still debated. Historians argue over the exact pass Hannibal used the size of his army, when he began, and how many survived the descent. The evidence remains incomplete, and later retellings often polish hardship into legend. Yet even stripped of exaggeration, the achievement is astonishing. Hannibal moves a multinational army from Spain across Gaul, over the mountains and into northern Italy, where Rome does not expect a Carthaginian commander to appear with such force. This is the moment fear becomes physical. It is no longer Carthage as a distant port, a fleet, a treaty partner, or a defeated rival. It is Carthage on Italian soil. Hannibal's army descends into a landscape Rome considers part of its strategic body, among peoples only recently subdued or imperfectly loyal. The Roman system depends on allies, roads, colonies, and the belief that Rome protects those bound to it. Hannibal understands that if he can break that belief, he may not need to storm Rome itself. He can make Rome's world come apart around it. His genius is not only tactical, though his tactics become legendary. He knows how to use resentment. Northern Italy is full of communities with reasons to dislike Roman expansion. Gauls who have fought Rome see in Hannibal a chance to reverse the pressure from the south. Hannibal recruits, negotiates promises, and adapts. His army is not a simple Carthaginian force. It includes Africans, Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and others held together by leadership, success, expectation of reward, and the magnetic danger of the campaign itself. Rome is facing not just a foreign army, but a moving coalition of grievances. At the Trebia in 218 BCE, Hannibal gives Rome its first great lesson in what kind of enemy he is. Roman aggression and confidence become tools in his hands. He draws the Roman army into battle under terrible conditions, uses concealment and timing, and turns the field into a trap. At Lake Trasimene the next year, he does something even more unnerving. He ambushes an entire Roman army between hills and water, creating one of the largest ambushes in ancient military history. Fog terrain, impatience, and Hannibal's planning combine into disaster. For Rome, these are not merely defeats, they are humiliations of judgment. Roman commanders are being outthought. The psychological effect is severe. Rome can understand losing through force. It has done so before. It has lost battles and returned stronger. But Hannibal makes Roman habits feel dangerous. Boldness becomes rashness. Discipline becomes predictability. The desire to force battle becomes the path to annihilation. In response, Rome turns to delay under Fabius Maximus, whose strategy avoids direct battle and tries to wear Hannibal down. The approach is deeply uncomfortable for a culture that honors aggressive courage, and ancient writers preserve the tension around it. Fabius is mocked by some for caution, yet his caution recognizes a terrible truth. Hannibal is too dangerous to be treated like a normal opponent. A lesser-known detail in this period is how much Hannibal's campaign depends on movement through lived landscapes, not empty maps. Italy is not just a theatre of war. It is farms, shrines, walled towns, river valleys, grazing land roads, vineyards, grain stores, and communities calculating survival. Hannibal must feed his army without a secure supply line from Carthage. Rome must protect allies while avoiding traps. Each march creates pressure. Each burned field or seized harvest sends a message. War becomes a test of political endurance as much as military skill. Hannibal wants Rome's allies to believe Rome can no longer defend them. Rome wants them to believe Hannibal cannot stay forever. Then comes Cannae. The name becomes almost too heavy to carry. In 216 BCE, Rome gathers an enormous army determined to crush Hannibal by weight of numbers. The battlefield lies in Apulia under summer heat near the Aufidus River. Hannibal arranges his forces with a flexible centre and strong wings, using cavalry superiority and infantry discipline to create a double envelopment. The Roman mass pushes forward, believing it is breaking the Carthaginian centre, only to find itself compressed, surrounded, and killed in numbers so vast that ancient figures may be exaggerated, but the scale of disaster is beyond doubt. Tens of thousands die. Senators, magistrates, citizens, allies, entire family lines are swallowed by the field. Cannae is not only a battle, it is an argument against Roman destiny. For a moment the Republic appears mortal. The road to Rome is not literally open in the simple way later imagination sometimes suggests, because siege supply walls and politics are complex. Hannibal does not march immediately on the city, and scholars still debate whether he could have taken it if he tried. But for Romans living through the aftermath, the strategic nuance matters less than the shock. An enemy from Carthage has destroyed the greatest army Rome could assemble. If allies defect, if panic spreads, if another major power joins decisively, Rome might not survive. Some allies do defect. Capua, one of Italy's richest cities, eventually turns to Hannibal. Others waver weight or bargain. Yet many remain loyal, and this becomes one of the deep reasons Rome endures. Hannibal can win battles, but he cannot easily dissolve the Roman alliance system quickly enough. Rome refuses to negotiate. This refusal is extraordinary. A state that has lost so many men might be expected to seek terms. Rome instead raises more forces arms younger and poorer men, adjusts strategy, punishes disloyalty and keeps fighting. What survives in the record suggests an almost frightening collective discipline. Fear exists, but it is forced into endurance. Still, endurance does not erase terror. The memory of Hannibal in Italy lasts because he remains there year after year, a living contradiction of Roman security. Children grow up with the war still present. Farms are ruined. Cities change sides. Armies maneuver around a commander no one can afford to underestimate. Hannibal becomes a kind of shadow moving through the peninsula, not always victorious, increasingly constrained but never harmless. Every Roman success must be measured against the fact that he is still there. This is why later Roman fear of Carthage cannot be understood only through treaties or military balances. It is emotional, inherited, almost domestic. Hannibal brings Carthage into Roman homes through casualty lists, family mourning lost estates, broken confidence, and stories told by survivors. He teaches Rome that a rival across the sea can find a way into Italy itself. He teaches Rome that distance can fail. Even after he is recalled and defeated, the lesson remains. Carthage may be humbled, but Carthage has produced Hannibal once. In the Roman imagination, that is enough to wonder whether it could produce another. The Second Punic War is not yet over after Cannae. In some ways, Rome's most important response is only beginning. It must learn not merely how to survive Hannibal, but how to defeat the world that made him possible. That means Spain. It means Africa. It means commanders who can think beyond Italy. And eventually it means a Roman named Scipio, who understands that to remove Hannibal from Roman soil, Rome must carry the war back to Carthage itself. After Cannae, Rome enters one of the strangest moments in its history, a moment when the Republic is still alive, still organized, still issuing commands, yet surrounded by the evidence of its own possible extinction. The battlefield has not merely killed soldiers, it has killed confidence. In Roman houses, the scale of loss is almost impossible to measure by normal grief. Fathers, sons, brothers, patrons, clients, neighbours and magistrates vanish into the same catastrophe. The political class itself is wounded. The army that should have restored control has been consumed. The rituals of public mourning must be restrained because too much visible despair can become a political danger. Rome cannot allow itself the luxury of breaking down. This is where Hannibal's invasion becomes more than a brilliant campaign. It becomes a test of the Roman system at its deepest level. The Republic has always claimed that it can absorb defeat. Now that claim is forced into the open. Armies must be raised again, even when the pool of experienced men has been drained. Allies must be reassured, even when Rome has failed to protect them. Commanders must be chosen, even when recent commanders have led men to slaughter. The Senate must appear calm, because if Rome's own leaders seem uncertain, the entire network of Italian loyalty may unravel. What survives in the record suggests that Roman discipline after Cannae is not the absence of fear, but fear turned into procedure. The danger is real. Capua, wealthy and proud, defects to Hannibal, and its decision sends a tremor through Italy. Other communities in southern Italy shift, hesitate, or calculate which side is more likely to prevail. Syracuse in Sicily eventually becomes a theatre of crisis. Macedon under Philip V looks toward alliance with Hannibal, raising the possibility that Rome's war could widen across the Adriatic. No single explanation fully accounts for why the Roman alliance system does not collapse more completely. Fear of Rome, hatred of Carthage, Local rivalries, political divisions inside allied cities, and simple caution all play their part. But one thing is clear: Hannibal's plan comes closer to success than later Roman triumphal memory likes to admit. Still, Rome refuses the one thing Hannibal most needs it to do. It refuses to accept defeat as final. It refuses negotiation after Cannae. It refuses to treat battlefield annihilation as political annihilation. This refusal becomes one of the defining facts of Roman history. The Republic can be wounded in the body and still continue through its institutions, alliances, habits, and stubborn belief that survival requires action rather than surrender. There is something frightening in this, even from a distance of centuries. Rome loses armies the way other states lose wars, and then it demands another army. The human cost of that endurance is immense. Younger men are drawn in. Emergency measures expand the boundaries of who can serve. Enslaved men are reportedly armed under special conditions, an extraordinary sign of crisis in a society built on rigid status divisions. Debts, taxes, requisitions, and sacrifices accumulate. Farms lie exposed to raids. Communities must supply troops and grain while wondering whether Hannibal will appear on the road. The war is not an abstract duel between famous commanders. It is a long pressure applied to ordinary lives, to mothers counting sons, to farmers hiding stores, to town councils weighing loyalty to soldiers who know that the enemy across the field has already destroyed armies larger than theirs. Hannibal's own position is more difficult than his victories suggest. He can win battles with astonishing skill, but he cannot easily replace losses from a secure base. Carthage supports him, but not always with the scale or consistency he needs, and scholars still debate whether this reflects political rivalry, logistical limits, strategic disagreement, or the simple difficulty of sustaining a war in Italy while other theatres remain active. His army must live off the land and through alliances. His cavalry, especially Numidian horsemen, gives him mobility and striking power, but mobility is not the same as conquest. He can punish, persuade, and inspire defections, yet many Italian communities remain tied to Rome by fear, advantage, habit, or genuine loyalty. Rome adapts by refusing Hannibal the kind of decisive battle he wants. After Cannae, Roman commanders become more cautious, not always perfectly, but enough to change the rhythm of war. They shadow contain, cut off allies, retake towns, and attack Carthaginian positions elsewhere. The war spreads across maps rather than ending in a single field. In Spain, the struggle grows crucial because Spain is the source of Barcid wealth and manpower. If Rome can sever Hannibal from that foundation, his Italian campaign becomes a brilliant blade without a handle. This wider strategy slowly transforms the war from Hannibal's invasion into Rome's counterattack against the entire Carthaginian system. One of the most surprising details of this period is that Rome survives partly because it learns to be less Roman in the narrow sense. The old hunger for immediate open battle gives way painfully to patience, intelligence, siegecraft diplomacy, and strategic sequencing. Rome still values courage, but courage is no longer allowed to mean charging straight into Hannibal's design. The Republic learns from humiliation. It learns that discipline must include restraint. It learns that a commander's glory can be dangerous if it tempts him to fight on the enemy's terms. This lesson is bought with bodies at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. Meanwhile, Hannibal becomes trapped inside his own legend. Every victory proves his greatness, but each year that Rome does not collapse makes victory less decisive. He can defeat Roman armies, yet the Roman state remains. He can frighten Rome, yet not force it to submit. He can win allies, yet not enough. He can remain in Italy, yet not convert presence into final triumph. The evidence remains incomplete regarding many local decisions, but the larger pattern is unmistakable. Hannibal's campaign is militarily magnificent and strategically incomplete. He exposes Rome's vulnerability without finding a way to destroy Rome's capacity to regenerate. This is the paradox that later Romans remember with both terror and pride. Hannibal shows them the abyss, and Rome discovers that it can stand near it without falling. But standing near the abyss changes a people. It teaches them to hate uncertainty. It teaches them to distrust half measures. It teaches them that mercy toward a dangerous rival may become a future battlefield where Roman sons die by the tens of thousands. Long after the immediate crisis passes, the emotional logic remains if Carthage survives another Hannibal might come. The turning of the war begins when Roman pressure in Spain grows more effective and when Publius Cornelius Scipio rises into command. Scipio is young, ambitious, and shaped by the very disasters that have broken older men. He understands something vital: Hannibal cannot be defeated only by avoiding him in Italy. The war must be taken to the sources of Carthaginian recovery. Spain must be taken. Carthage must be threatened at home. Hannibal must be made to look backward. By the time Scipio carries Roman arms into Africa, the war has changed its moral temperature. Rome is no longer merely defending Italy. It is learning the offensive confidence of a Mediterranean power. The same republic that once struggled to build fleets now sends armies across seas with the sense of purpose hardened by trauma. Hannibal's victories have made Rome more dangerous, not less. They have taught it that survival may require striking beyond the immediate battlefield, beyond the enemy army into the enemy's wealth, alliances, and future. When Hannibal is finally recalled from Italy, the symbolism is enormous. The man who invaded Rome's world must return to defend his own. At Zama in 202 BCI, Scipio defeats him, and the Second Punic War ends with Carthage humbled, stripped of its war fleet, deprived of its overseas possessions, bound by indemnity, and forbidden to wage war without Roman permission. Rome has survived the nightmare. It has defeated the enemy who seemed almost sent by fate to destroy it. Yet victory does not bring peace to memory. The Republic emerges stronger but also harder. It has learned that Carthage can be beaten only after immense suffering. It has learned that a defeated Carthage can rise in another form from Sicily to Spain, from fleet power to mountain invasion. It has learned that the distance between North Africa and Italy is not protection enough. And so, even after Zama, even after treaties, hostages, indemnities, and humiliation, the Roman mind does not rest. The war is over, but the fear has found a permanent home. Zama gives Rome victory, but it does not give Rome forgetfulness. The battlefield in North Africa ends the Second Punic War in formal terms, yet the deeper conflict continues inside Roman memory. Carthage is forced into a settlement designed to make future greatness impossible. It loses its overseas possessions. It surrenders most of its warships. It must pay a heavy indemnity across decades. It cannot wage war outside Africa, and even within Africa it must act only under Roman permission. These terms are not merely punishment, they are architecture. Rome is building a cage around the enemy that once brought war into Italy. At first the cage appears strong. Carthage is no longer a Mediterranean empire. It has no Spanish Silver Empire to nourish another Barcid army. It has no great fleet with which to challenge Roman sea power. Its foreign policy is no longer truly independent. Rome has taken from Carthage the tools that made Hannibal possible, or so it seems. But fear is not always satisfied by logic. To Romans who remember Cannae or whose fathers remember it, the problem is not only what Carthage can do today. The problem is what Carthage has already shown itself capable of becoming under pressure. Rome's victory also changes Rome. The republic that emerges after 202 BCE is not the same power that first crossed into Sicily. It now has provinces, fleets, commanders with international reputations, and a widening sense that Roman security depends on shaping events far beyond Italy. Spain remains a battlefield of control. Greece and the eastern Mediterranean draw Roman armies and diplomacy into older conflicts among kings and leagues. North Africa becomes a watched frontier. Rome is still a republic, still speaking the language of tradition, Senate magistracies and ancestral virtue, but its reach has become imperial. It has learned to live with power on a scale its older institutions were not designed to manage. Carthage, meanwhile, becomes a strange kind of survivor. It is defeated, watched, and politically limited, but it is not ruined. Its harbour still exists. Its merchants still know markets. Its land remains fertile. Its aristocrats still have estates, experience, and connections. Its people still wake each day in a city with temples, workshops, warehouses, homes, and memories older than Rome's empire. The evidence remains incomplete because Roman destruction and later rebuilding have complicated the archaeological picture, but what survives suggests that Carthage after Hannibal is not a ghost town. It is a living city trying to breathe within Roman limits. This is what Rome cannot comfortably accept. A dead enemy is simple. A living defeated enemy is more complicated. Carthage pays what it owes. It follows many of the treaty's limits. It avoids the kind of open provocation that would make immediate destruction easy to justify. Yet its economic recovery becomes visible enough to disturb Roman observers. A city that can pay off its indemnity early does not look broken. A city that remains wealthy without empire suggests that Carthaginian strength was deeper than fleets and foreign bases. Its farms, trade, labour systems, and urban organisation still function. For Roman hawks, this is not evidence of harmless recovery. It is evidence that the danger has only been sleeping. There is also humiliation on the Carthaginian side. Carthage has to live under the gaze of the enemy that defeated it. Its politics are constrained by the knowledge that any major action may be judged in Rome. Its old military dignity is gone. Its former commander, Hannibal, after attempting reforms that may have threatened entrenched interests, eventually leaves the city and spends his later years moving through the courts of Rome's enemies, a living relic of Roman fear. Even in exile, Hannibal remains powerful as a symbol. His body is far away, but his name still moves through Roman imagination like a warning. The peace after the Second Punic War is therefore not true reconciliation. It is a pause built on imbalance. Rome has the power to intervene. Carthage has the wealth to recover, but not the freedom to defend itself fully. Around them, the Mediterranean is changing. Rome is no longer simply one major power among others. It is becoming the arbiter whose approval or anger can decide the fate of cities and kings. Carthage is no longer Rome's equal, but it remains too famous, too wealthy, and too close to be ignored. No single explanation fully accounts for why Rome later chooses destruction rather than continued containment, but this uneasy peace makes the choice imaginable. A lesser-known and important feature of this period is that Roman fear of Carthage survives even as Roman power grows far beyond Carthage's. This seems irrational only if power is measured purely by armies and fleets. Political memory does not work that way. A society does not easily forget the enemy that once made its survival uncertain. The Second Punic War becomes a moral lesson repeated across generations Rome endured because it refused surrender, and Carthage was dangerous because it nearly made endurance fail. Once that lesson hardens, every sign of Carthaginian recovery can be interpreted through suspicion. Carthage also suffers from being useful as an enemy. Roman politics needs examples. Senators argue about policy ambition, morality, and security, and Carthage offers a symbol that nearly everyone understands. To call Carthage dangerous is to invoke a shared nightmare. It requires no long explanation. The word itself carries battlefields. It carries elephants in the Alps smoke in Italian fields and dead citizens at Cannae. A politician who warns against Carthage is not merely discussing North African trade. He is speaking to ancestral fear, yet the reality on the ground is more complex. Carthage is not rebuilding Hannibal's empire. It is not preparing a new Alpine invasion. Its military freedom is limited. Its strategic position is weak compared with Rome's expanding reach. Scholars still debate the degree to which Rome genuinely feared a restored Carthaginian threat, versus using that fear to justify expansion. The most convincing answer may be that the two motives cannot be separated. Fear can be sincere and convenient at the same time. A Roman senator might truly believe Carthage is dangerous while also knowing that destroying it would enrich Rome, secure Africa, and remove a rival commercial centre. This mixture of fear and opportunity is one of the darker engines of history. Great powers rarely act from one motive only. They remember injuries, calculate advantages, imagine threats, and clothe ambition in the language of necessity. Rome looks at Carthage and sees a defeated city. It also sees a former empire, a wealthy port, fertile lands, and a name that still has the power to disturb sleep. Every one of these visions is true in part, and together they create a policy that becomes increasingly severe. The peace after Zama also leaves Carthage vulnerable to a different kind of enemy, a neighbour who can attack while Rome judges the response. That neighbour is Numidia under Massinissa, Rome's ally, and one of the great survivors of the age. Massinissa understands the new order very well. He knows Carthage cannot freely fight back without risking Roman condemnation. He knows Rome is inclined to favour him. He knows that pressure applied slowly may succeed where open conquest might provoke complications. Carthage's cage is not only made of treaty clauses, it is made of geography, diplomacy, and Roman bias. As years pass, Carthage finds itself in a cruel position. If it remains passive, it loses land and dignity. If it defends itself, it may be accused of violating the treaty. Rome's victory has created a trap in which Carthaginian survival itself can be made to look like defiance. The city that once challenged Rome across the sea is now forced to argue for justice before judges who remember Hannibal. Victory without peace is therefore the true aftermath of the Second Punic War. Rome wins the war, but not the freedom from fear it expected victory to bring. Carthage loses the war, but not the vitality that makes Rome suspicious. Between them stands a treaty meant to end rivalry, yet it preserves the emotional conditions for another conflict. Rome has learned that Carthage can recover from defeat. Carthage has learned that Roman mercy has limits. And in the decades after Zama, while the Mediterranean adjusts to Roman dominance, the old enemy on the African coast continues to live, trade farm pay endure, and remind Rome of a terrifying fact: destruction had not yet been final. Carthage after defeat is supposed to be a lesson in obedience. Rome has written the terms, taken the ship, stripped away the empire, and left the city with enough life to pay its debt, but not enough freedom to become dangerous again. That at least is the theory. Yet ancient states do not always obey the neat categories imposed on them by victors. Carthage is wounded, but it is still Carthage. Its walls still rise above the coast. Its harbours still hold movement. Its countryside still produces grain olives, fruit livestock, and wealth. Its merchants still understand prices routes, storage risk, and credit. A city that has spent centuries learning how to survive through exchange does not forget those skills, because a treaty says it must be humbled. The decades after Zama reveal something Rome finds difficult to accept: Carthage's strength was never only military. Hannibal's armies had made Rome fear Carthaginian command, but the deeper power of the city lies in its ability to generate resources. North Africa is not an empty backdrop. It is one of the great agricultural regions of the ancient Mediterranean, with zones capable of producing enormous surpluses when organised, irrigated, managed and taxed effectively. Punic landowners and farmers know this landscape intimately. Later, Romans will benefit from the same fertility, turning Africa into one of the grain baskets of their empire. That future is already present in the soil Carthage works before its destruction. This is one of the details that makes the Roman anxiety more understandable, even if not morally defensible. If Carthage can become wealthy again without an overseas empire, then the peace settlement has not solved the problem in Roman eyes. It has removed one form of power while leaving another intact. A war fleet can be surrendered. A colony can be lost. A silver district in Spain can be taken. But agricultural knowledge, commercial habits, family wealth, skilled labour, and the memory of how to organise a city do not vanish so easily. The evidence remains incomplete because Carthaginian records are fragmentary and filtered through enemy voices, but what survives in Roman concern suggests that prosperity itself became suspicious. Carthage's recovery is not only economic, it is psychological. Defeated cities often face a choice between bitterness and adaptation, and Carthage seems to do both. It cannot openly challenge Rome, so it turns inward and local. It pays, it farms, it trades, it reforms where it must, it survives under insult. There is dignity in this, though Roman sources rarely grant it. The old imperial horizon has narrowed, but within that narrower space the city remains active and disciplined. For ordinary Carthaginians, life after defeat may have been less about grand strategy than about keeping households, workshops, estates, temples and markets functioning beneath the weight of Roman supervision. Still, politics inside Carthage must have been tense. Hannibal himself, after the war, becomes involved in civic reform, apparently targeting corruption and financial mismanagement. Ancient accounts suggest he helped make the payment of the Roman indemnity more efficient, exposing how much wealth had been controlled by elites. Scholars still debate the details because the surviving sources are shaped by later political agendas, but the broad picture is plausible. A defeated city pressured by Rome struggles internally over who pays, who profits, and who bears the humiliation of defeat. Hannibal's reforms make him enemies at home as well as abroad. Eventually, Roman pressure and local hostility drive him into exile. His departure is symbolic. The man who embodied Carthage's defiance no longer belongs safely in Carthage. Rome's fear reaches into the city's internal politics. Even after Hannibal is gone, his absence remains a gain of presence. Rome has removed the commander, but it has not removed the memory of what he proved possible. Carthage without Hannibal is still watched as though Hannibal's ghost might one day command again. The city's wealth becomes most alarming when the indemnity is paid off. Rome had expected Carthage to spend decades under financial burden, and indeed the treaty required payments over 50 years. When Carthage is able to complete this obligation, it should in theory mark successful compliance. Instead, it can be read as evidence of danger. A poor enemy is dependent. A solvent enemy has options. The Roman mind, already trained by 2 terrible wars, turns prosperity into warning. The logic is circular but powerful. Carthage is dangerous because it recovers. Its recovery proves it is dangerous. This is not paranoia in the simple sense. Carthage had recovered before. After the First Punic War and the Mercenary War, it had rebuilt power in Spain. That recovery led eventually to Hannibal. Romans who draw a line from one humiliation to the next are not inventing everything from nothing, but they are also ignoring the changed world. After Zama, Rome's power is far greater, Carthage's freedom far smaller, and the Mediterranean increasingly shaped by Roman intervention. No single explanation fully accounts for Rome's later decision to destroy the city, because fear and advantage are braided together. Carthage is both less dangerous than Rome claims, and more resilient than Rome wishes. There is a colder aspect too. Rome may fear Carthage's recovery, because Rome understands recovery as something it does itself. Roman identity is built on coming back after defeat. The Republic knows the political power of endurance. It knows that a city can lose armies and still win a war if its institutions' alliances and will remain intact. In Carthage, Rome sees a distorted reflection of its own most dangerous quality, the refusal to stay beaten. The fear is therefore not only of Carthaginian ships or armies, it is the fear of another civilization with the same stubborn pulse. Meanwhile, the physical city continues to impress. Carthage is not a ruin waiting politely for destruction. It is crowded, wealthy, and strategically placed. Its houses climb the slopes. Its streets lead toward harbours and markets. Temples and public buildings maintain civic identity. Artisans produce goods. Traders negotiate. Farmers bring produce from the hinterland. Ships still connect the city to wider exchange even under restrictions. A Roman visitor could look at the city and see not submission but potential. Walls can be strengthened. Ships can be built again. Money can hire soldiers. A harbour can become a weapon if politics changes. That is how fear thinks it sees not only what exists but what could exist. The famous fig of Cato belongs to this atmosphere. Whether the scene happened exactly as later tradition tells it matters less than why the story survived. An old Roman statesman supposedly displays a fresh fig in the Senate and says it was picked near Carthage only days before proof of both the city's fertility and its frightening closeness. The image is simple enough for politics. Carthage is rich, near, and alive. The fruit becomes a strategic argument. It is not a sword, not a fleet, not an army. It is worse because it suggests the conditions from which armies and fleets can grow. For Carthage, this Roman gaze is a slow suffocation. Every sign of health is interpreted as guilt. Every act of self-preservation is suspect. The city can obey Rome and still be feared. It can pay Rome and still be condemned for having money. It can avoid foreign war and still be blamed for existing in a place too valuable and too memorable to leave alone. Scholars still debate how much genuine popular hatred in Rome drove policy, and how much elite calculation used hatred as a tool. But for the people of Carthage, the distinction may not have mattered. The result was the same: their survival became unacceptable. The wounded giant rebuilds, but it rebuilds inside a narrowing circle. To the west and south, Numidian power grows under Massinissa, Rome's ally, and Carthage's patient antagonist. To the north, Rome's attention never fully leaves. Inside the city, factions argue over how to respond to encroachment without inviting catastrophe. Outside the city, fields, borders, and towns become points of dispute. The treaty that once seemed to guarantee peace now becomes a mechanism by which Carthage can be weakened without a formal declaration of war. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome sees what it cannot tolerate: a Carthage that has lost an empire but not its vitality. That vitality is enough to awaken old nightmares and new ambitions. The next stage of the story does not begin with a Carthaginian invasion, or a fleet at sea, or another Hannibal marching toward Italy. It begins more quietly with border claims, diplomatic complaints, and the expansion of a neighbouring king who understands that Carthage is trapped between the need to defend itself and the Roman power to define defence as rebellion. Massinissa is one of those figures who stands at the edge of a larger story and quietly changes its direction. He's not Roman, and he is not Carthaginian, but without him, the final destruction of Carthage becomes harder to explain. He is king of Numidia, a realm of shifting alliances, cavalry traditions, agricultural potential and political ambition, lying beside Carthage in North Africa. During the Second Punic War he chooses Rome, or eventually comes to Rome's side after a complicated path through the politics of Numidian succession and Mediterranean war. That choice matters. Rome rewards loyalty, especially when loyalty helps defeat Hannibal. Carthage after Zama must now live beside a neighbour who has Roman favour-old grievances and a sharp understanding of the new balance of power. Numidia is not a marginal desert kingdom as older stereotypes sometimes imply. Its peoples are diverse, its territories varied, and its cavalry famous. Numidian horsemen had played important roles in the Punic Wars often, as mobile, elusive, devastating forces. Massinissa's achievement is political as much as military. He consolidates authority, expands influence, encourages settled agriculture in some regions, and positions himself as a partner of Rome. Ancient sources often present him through Roman interests, so the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests a ruler of great patience and opportunism. He understands that Carthage is no longer free to act like a sovereign equal. He also understands that Rome is unlikely to judge disputes neutrally. The treaty after the Second Punic War forbids Carthage from waging war without Roman permission. On paper, this is a security measure. In practice, it creates a trap. If Massinissa presses claims against Carthaginian territory, Carthage can appeal to Rome, but Rome has reasons to favour Massinissa. If Carthage resists by force, it risks being accused of breaking the treaty. A city once feared for its armies is now made vulnerable by the very restrictions imposed to prevent war. Its enemy no longer needs to defeat it in open battle. He can nibble at its borders, provoke its frustration, and wait for Rome to decide that Carthaginian self-defense is a crime. This pressure unfolds over years. Massinissa seizes disputed lands, pushes boundaries, and tests how much Carthage can endure. Roman commissions are sent to judge claims, but judgment is rarely reassuring for Carthage. The Roman political class is not a court above the conflict. It is a participant in the memory of the conflict. To many Romans, Massinissa is the loyal ally who helped defeat Hannibal, while Carthage is the old enemy, whose complaints sound like the first notes of renewed defiance. Scholars still debate the exact legal merits of particular territorial disputes because our sources are thin and biased, but the broad pattern is clear enough. Carthage is steadily humiliated, and Rome allows it. The cruelty of the situation lies in its slowness. Sudden catastrophe can be met with courage or panic. Slow strangulation demands a different kind of endurance. Carthage loses land not in one dramatic conquest, but through repeated disputes that drain confidence and expose helplessness. Its leaders must decide again and again whether to protest, yield, negotiate, or risk everything. Each concession weakens the city. Each act of resistance endangers it. Roman power does not have to stand constantly at the gates. It is present in every calculation. Massinissa's ambitions also reveal that Rome's fear of Carthage is not the only force at work. North Africa has its own politics. Numidia is rising, and Carthage, though weakened, still possesses wealth and prestige. For Massinissa, expanding at Carthage's expense strengthens his kingdom and reduces an old rival. For Rome, Numidian pressure keeps Carthage contained without requiring direct annexation. This arrangement works until it works too well. By making Carthage desperate, it creates the very breach Rome can use as a final pretext. Carthage's internal politics during this pressure must have been bitter. Some likely favoured continued submission, believing that Rome's wrath would be worse than any loss of land. Others saw submission as slow death. What survives in the record suggests factional conflict with pro-Numidian, pro-Roman, and more assertive elements struggling over policy. The details are uncertain, but the dilemma is unmistakable. A city cannot remain politically healthy when every defense of its interests may be treated as provocation. Carthage is asked to behave like a living state, while being denied the basic reflexes of one. The breaking point comes when Carthage finally acts militarily against Massinissa without Roman approval. From a Carthaginian perspective, this can be understood as a desperate response to intolerable encroachment. From a Roman perspective, or at least the Roman perspective that wants war, it is a treaty violation. The distinction is fatal. Rome does not need to prove that Carthage is preparing another Hannibalic invasion. It only needs to point to the treaty and say that Carthage has broken the rules. No single explanation fully accounts for Rome's response unless one sees how law, fear, and opportunity combine. The legal pretext is real enough to be useful. The fear is real enough to be persuasive. The opportunity is real enough to be tempting. Massinissa, by then elderly but still formidable, has spent decades shaping the board. His pressure has helped expose Carthage's vulnerability, yet Rome must also watch him carefully. A too powerful Numidia could become its own concern. This is another layer often missed in simpler versions of the story. Rome does not destroy Carthage merely to hand North Africa to Massinissa without thought. Rome is learning to manage entire regions by balancing allies, punishing rivals, and eventually taking direct control when indirect control no longer satisfies. Carthage's fall will not simply be Numidia's triumph. It will be Rome's statement that no major Western Mediterranean power will exist outside its permission. There is a tragic irony in Carthage's final mistake. The city that Rome fears as cunning, treacherous, and dangerous is destroyed partly because it behaves in a way any sovereign state might understand. It tries to defend itself against a neighbour's aggression. But sovereignty is exactly what Carthage has lost. Its action is not judged by ordinary standards of survival. It is judged by the rules written after its defeat. Rome has created a world in which Carthage can be guilty simply by acting alive. The emotional logic in Rome now intensifies. For men like Cato, Carthage's prosperity has already been proof of danger. Its conflict with Massinissa becomes further proof. The old enemy is not peaceful, they can argue. The old enemy is restless. It has taken up arms. It has violated the treaty. That the situation was provoked that Rome had favoured the provocateur, that Carthage had endured years of losses, these complications are politically inconvenient. Fear prefers clean stories. Carthage was dangerous before. Carthage is dangerous again. Therefore Carthage must end. Massinissa tightens the trap not because he alone commands Rome, but because his actions make Rome's desired conclusion easier to reach. He turns Carthage's weakness into a crisis. Rome turns that crisis into a case. The city on the coast, once master of sea lanes and rival of republics, finds itself cornered by a neighbour on land and a memory across the sea. Its leaders cannot undo the past. They cannot make Rome forget Hannibal. They cannot make their prosperity look harmless. They cannot defend their borders without confirming the suspicions of those who want them destroyed. By the time Roman envoys and armies move toward the final confrontation, Carthage has already lost the argument in Roman minds. The coming war will be presented as punishment for treaty violation, as necessary security, as the completion of unfinished business. But beneath the legal language lies something older and darker. Rome has found a way to transform fear into procedure. It can now destroy Carthage not as an act of panic, but as an act of policy. And policy once wrapped in law and memory can be far colder than rage. Cato's obsession with Carthage is remembered because it is simple, almost brutally simple. An old Roman statesman rises again and again, and whatever subject has been discussed, whatever matter of roads, taxes, alliances, or internal politics has filled the Senate, he returns to the same conclusion: Carthage must be destroyed. Later tradition sharpens this into a repeated formula, a closing blow at the end of speeches, and even if the exact wording has been shaped by memory, the political force behind it is real. Cato turns Carthage from a foreign policy problem into a moral reflex. To leave it standing is not caution. To him it is negligence. He's not a young man seeking glory in an easy war. That makes his role more interesting. Cato the Elder belongs to an older Roman world of stern discipline, agricultural virtue, suspicion of luxury and hostility toward anything he sees as corrupting Roman character. He has lived through the age after Hannibal. He has watched Rome become richer, wider, more entangled with Greece, and the Eastern Mediterranean more imperial in practice, even as it speaks the language of republican restraint. For Cato, Carthage represents danger from outside, but also a test of Roman seriousness. A people that remembers its wounds should not leave the knife on the table. The famous fig story captures his method perfectly. During a Senate debate, he supposedly produces fresh figs from North Africa and points out how recently they were picked, reminding the senators that Carthage lies only a short voyage away. Scholars still debate the details of this anecdote, as ancient political memory often turns gestures into symbols too neat to be accidental. Yet the story survives because it compresses the argument into an image. The fruit is soft, ripe, ordinary, and terrifying. It says that Carthage is fertile. It says that Carthage is near. It says that wealth can cross the sea quickly, and so can war. Cato's demand does not exist in isolation. Rome in the 2nd century BCE is filled with debates over how to handle power. Some Romans favour harshness, others prefer managed domination. Some see Carthage as a commercial rival, others as a strategic threat, others as a useful political symbol. Not every Roman voice is identical. Scipio Nasica, according to later tradition, argues against destroying Carthage, believing that a surviving rival helps keep Rome disciplined and morally alert. Whether this argument is preserved exactly as he made it is uncertain, but the contrast matters. Romans themselves could understand that removing every fear might have consequences. An empire without rivals may begin to turn its violence inward. Still, Cato's side wins because fear is easier to organize than restraint. Carthage's recovery, Massinissa's disputes, the treaty violation, and the memory of Hannibal all become parts of one persuasive pattern. The old enemy is alive. The old enemy is wealthy. The old enemy has taken up arms. The old enemy is close. From these pieces, Rome constructs inevitability. It does not have to prove that Carthage is ready to invade Italy. It only has to make the possibility feel intolerable. There is lesser-known cruelty in how political slogans work. They simplify the world until complicated facts can no longer breathe. Carthage is not the Carthage of Hannibal's prime. It has no great fleet, no Spanish Empire, no freedom of war. Its action against Massinissa comes after years of pressure. But once the slogan hardens, these distinctions become secondary. The city is reduced to a name, and the name is reduced to fear. Rome has fought Carthage for so long that it can no longer easily imagine a Mediterranean in which Carthage is merely a neighbour. Cato's obsession also speaks to the psychology of trauma in states. Individuals remember terror through bodies and dreams. States remember it through ceremonies, stories, policy, and inherited enemies. Rome's trauma is not modern in language, but it is visible in behaviour. The Republic keeps returning to the possibility of repetition. If Carthage once produced Hannibal after defeat, perhaps defeat is not enough. If Carthage once recovered in Spain, after losing Sicily, perhaps restrictions are not enough. If Carthage can pay its debts early, perhaps poverty was never enough. The only solution that promises absolute security is removal. That promise is false in a deeper sense. No destruction can remove fear from history. Rome will discover new enemies, new anxieties, new frontiers, new rivals, and eventually new civil wars. But in the moment, the destruction of Carthage feels like a way to close an open wound. It offers a clean ending to an unclean century. It transforms memory into action. It gives Roman leaders a chance to say that what almost happened during Hannibal's war will never be allowed to happen again. The Carthaginians themselves have little power over how they are imagined. Their own arguments, fears, and memories survive only faintly. This is one of the greatest silences in the story. We know Rome's fear far better than Carthage's dread. We hear the voices of senators more clearly than the voices of families inside the threatened city. What survives in the record suggests that Carthage tries to avoid disaster through concessions, diplomacy, and desperate compliance once Roman intentions become clear. But by then the Roman debate has moved beyond ordinary punishment. The question is no longer whether Carthage should be restrained. It is whether Carthage should continue to exist where it stands. Cato becomes the face of that answer, but the answer requires more than one man. It requires a political class willing to accept annihilation as policy. It requires commanders, envoys, legal arguments, public support, and a Senate that sees advantage in finality. It also requires the gradual erosion of pity. For destruction on this scale to become acceptable, the enemy must first be made into a permanent threat, almost a force of nature. Carthage must stop being imagined as a city of people and become a problem to be solved. That transformation is nearly complete by the time Rome sends its demands. The Carthaginians initially submit in ways that show just how badly they want to avoid war. They provide hostages, including children from leading families. They surrender weapons. They try to prove obedience. Each concession should make war less necessary if Rome's goal is only security. Instead, each concession reveals the deeper goal more clearly. Rome is not seeking merely to disarm Carthage. Rome is testing how far the city can be broken before it resists. The final demand, as ancient sources present it, is unbearable. The Carthaginians must abandon their city and move inland away from the sea. For a maritime civilization, this is not relocation. It is a kind of civic death. Carthage without its harbour is no longer Carthage. Its identity, wealth, memory, gods, graves, houses, and history are tied to that coast. To demand that the people leave is to ask the city to erase itself without Roman soldiers needing to burn it. Scholars still debate aspects of the diplomatic sequence because the sources are Roman and later, but the broad meaning is clear. Rome offers survival only at the price of self-destruction. At that moment, fear changes sides. Rome has feared Carthage for generations. Now Carthage understands that submission will not save it. There are no more clever negotiations, no more payments, no more legal appeals, no more hope that obedience will be enough. The city that once sent Hannibal into Italy is now cornered on its own shore, stripped of weapons, deprived of its children as hostages, and told to give up the sea that made it. The Roman slogan has become a sentence. Cato may not live to see every detail of the final destruction, but his logic survives him. Carthage must be destroyed, not watched, not humbled, not taxed, not reduced, destroyed. In that word lies the full distance Rome has travelled from fear to policy, and in Carthage's refusal to abandon itself lies the beginning of the last desperate war. Not a war for empire, not a war for Sicily or Spain, not a war to decide who commands the Mediterranean, but a war over whether a city has the right to remain alive in the place where its memory was born. The Third Punic War begins with a strange imbalance. Rome arrives with overwhelming power, but Carthage begins with the deeper desperation. This is not the first war between the two cities. Yet it is unlike the others. There is no Hannibal in Italy, no great Carthaginian empire in Spain, no vast naval contest for Sicily. The old rivalry has been reduced to something more intimate and more terrible. Rome no longer seeks to defeat Carthage's armies abroad. It seeks to decide whether Carthage may remain Carthage at all. At first, the Carthaginians try to avoid the abyss. They send embassies. They accept humiliating demands. They hand over hostages, a devastating act for elite families who understand that their children are now living guarantees of obedience. They surrender weapons and armour in enormous quantities. Ancient figures for these deliveries may be rounded or exaggerated, but the meaning is unmistakable. Carthage is trying to prove that it does not want war. It is stripping itself of defence in the hope that submission will satisfy Rome. What survives in the record suggests that the city still believes or wants to believe that there is a limit to Roman severity. Then comes the demand that makes everything clear. The people of Carthage must leave their city and settle inland away from the sea. Rome frames this as survival. The Carthaginians hear it as annihilation by another name. A port city ordered away from its harbour is not being spared. It is being separated from its lungs. The sea is not scenery to Carthage. It is ancestry, livelihood, memory and power. Its dead are buried there. Its temples stand there. Its homes, warehouses, docks, markets, and sacred spaces belong to that landscape. To abandon the coast would be to accept that Carthage can live only by ceasing to be itself, so the city refuses. This refusal is not a return to imperial ambition. It is the reflex of a community pushed beyond surrender. Rome has taken the weapons, but not the will. The Carthaginians close their gates and prepare for a siege they are not supposed to be able to endure. In Roman expectation, the city should collapse quickly. It has been disarmed. It has no great fleet. It faces the strongest power in the Mediterranean. But Carthage, cornered and humiliated, finds a last reserve of energy. The war Rome chose becomes harder than Rome expected. Inside the city, everything turns towards survival. Workshops become armories. Temples, houses and public spaces are drawn into the emergency. Women are said to have cut their hair to make ropes for catapults, a detail that may carry the polish of ancient dramatic storytelling, yet it captures a plausible truth about total civic mobilization. Metal is gathered, weapons are improvised, and labor is organized with desperate speed. The Carthaginians had surrendered arms to avoid war. Now they must manufacture war from whatever remains. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, but the larger picture is powerful. A supposedly defeated city transforms itself into a fortress by will, skill, and fear. Rome's first efforts are clumsy. The city's defences are formidable, and its position remains strong. Carthage sits on a peninsula with access to the sea walls, harbours, and dense urban terrain. Siege warfare is slow, technical, and cruel. It is not enough to hate a city. One must breach it, starve it, isolate it, and survive its counterattacks. Roman commanders discover that Carthage is not simply waiting for destruction. Its defenders strike back, repair damage, and exploit Roman mistakes. For a war justified as necessary against a weakened enemy, the resistance is embarrassing. This embarrassment matters politically. Rome has chosen the war, and now it must finish it. A quick punishment has become a prolonged siege. Carthage's endurance threatens the narrative that the city is already broken and only needs to be removed. Every month it holds out becomes another reminder of the very resilience Rome fears. The logic folds in on itself. Carthage must be destroyed because it is dangerous, and its resistance proves it is dangerous, even though that resistance exists because Rome has demanded its civic death. The war also exposes the moral emptiness of Rome's legal pretext. If the goal were only to punish a treaty violation, Carthage's surrender of hostages and weapons would have been enough to secure compliance. If the goal were only to prevent future aggression, disarmament had already done much of the work. But the demand to move inland reveals that Rome wants the removal of Carthage as a coastal power, perhaps the removal of Carthage as a living historical identity. Scholars still debate the precise balance of fear, economic interest, strategic calculation, and domestic Roman politics behind this decision, but by this point the result is unmistakable. Rome has defined security as the enemy's disappearance. Carthage's defenders include more than soldiers. A siege turns civilians into participants whether they choose it or not. Food must be rationed, fires must be controlled, walls must be repaired. The wounded must be carried through streets that were never designed for endless war. Families who gave children as hostages now face bombardment from the power holding those children. The psychological cruelty is difficult to overstate. Carthage fights not with the confidence of an empire, but with the knowledge that defeat may erase the city's future. Rome, for its part, continues to tighten the noose. Camps are built, assaults, attempted blockades improved. Command passes through hands until Scipio Aemilianus emerges as the decisive Roman figure. His name carries the echo of the earlier Scipio who defeated Hannibal at Zama. An ancient memory surely noticed the symmetry. A Scipio had ended Hannibal's war. Another Scipio would end Carthage itself. He brings discipline, energy, and seriousness to the siege. Under him, Roman operations become more effective, more systematic, and more relentless. The choice of Scipio Aemilianus also reveals Rome's need for symbolic closure. Carthage is not just another city to be taken. It is the enemy around which Roman identity has been sharpened for more than a century. Its final defeat must feel like history completing a circle. Yet the reality beneath the symbolism remains brutal, and material trenches walls, hunger, disease, timber, iron ships, ladders, towers, corpses, and command decisions made under pressure. The fall of Carthage is not a clean, dramatic scene. It is a grinding technical operation against a city that refuses to make its own destruction easy. A lesser-known aspect of the siege is the naval improvisation on both sides. Though Carthage had surrendered its fleet, the harbour still matters. The defenders reportedly cut a new outlet to the sea and launched hastily built ships, astonishing the Romans. Even if some details are shaped by literary drama, the episode fits the larger pattern. Carthage's maritime instinct survives even in extremity. Rome tries to seal the city from the sea. Carthage tries to reopen its ancient lifeline. In miniature, the entire history of the rivalry appears again. Rome seeks enclosure, Carthage seeks movement. But movement is no longer enough. The Roman blockade tightens, hunger grows. The city's internal spaces become more desperate. The defenders may win moments, delay assaults, and embarrass commanders, but they cannot restore the strategic world that once made Carthage powerful. There is no Hannibal marching to rescue them, no Spanish Empire sending silver, no fleet commanding the Western Sea. The city is alone with its walls, its memory, and its people. The Third Punic War is therefore not a war Rome is forced into by immediate danger. It is a war Rome chooses because it no longer accepts uncertainty. Carthage's actual ability to threaten Rome is limited. Its symbolic ability to disturb Rome is immense. That distinction matters because states often act most violently where symbol and strategy overlap. Carthage is useful to destroy because it is both weakened enough to attack and famous enough for its destruction to mean something. As the siege continues, the old city becomes a container of all the fears, ambitions, and unfinished emotions of the previous century. Rome sees Hannibal in walls defended by men who never crossed the Alps. It sees future danger in workshops making desperate weapons from scraps. It sees rebellion in the refusal to abandon ancestral ground. Carthage sees with increasing clarity that Rome's peace was never going to allow it full life. The war Rome chose has become a war Carthage cannot avoid, and every day the city survives is both a miracle and a measure of how completely the world has turned against it. Carthage refuses to vanish in the way Rome expects defeated cities to vanish. It does not fold after the first demands. It does not dissolve after surrendering weapons. It does not accept exile from the sea. Instead, it turns inward, gathers what remains, and becomes a city of emergency. The streets that once carried merchants, priests, sailors, porters, farmers, and officials now carry timber stones, food, water, wounded men, and fragments of metal meant to become weapons before the next assault. The old commercial rhythm of the city is replaced by a harsher rhythm, repair, ration, watch, strike, bury, repeat. A siege reveals the anatomy of a city. In peace walls are symbols as much as defences harbours are. Places of exchange and streets are ordinary passages between ordinary needs. Under siege everything changes meaning. A roof becomes material, a courtyard becomes a workshop, a temple becomes a storehouse of courage or fear. Hair becomes rope, bronze becomes a blade, doors become barricades. Nothing is neutral anymore. Carthage, once famous for ships and trade, is forced to convert its own body into resistance. Rome has numbers, discipline, command structure, and the certainty that time favours the larger power. Carthage has walls, desperation, local knowledge, and a civic identity sharpened by the threat of erasure. This is why the siege becomes so difficult. A city defending territory may bargain. A city defending survival may calculate. But a city defending the right to remain itself can become unpredictable. The Carthaginians have already learned that obedience will not save them. That knowledge removes one of Rome's strongest tools. Fear of punishment matters less when punishment has already been declared limitless. The defenders work with astonishing speed. Weapons surrendered to Rome must be replaced. Workshops produce shields, swords, spears, missiles, and engines. Ancient accounts give impressive numbers for daily production, and while exact figures may be shaped by literary emphasis, the broader truth is hard to miss. Carthage mobilizes labor on a massive scale. Skilled craftsmen, enslaved workers, citizens, and officials are drawn into a single purpose. War is no longer the profession of an army. It becomes the work of the whole city. Hunger, however, is an enemy no courage can kill. As Rome improves, the blockade food becomes the quiet center of the siege. Grain stores shrink. Prices lose normal meaning. The difference between rich and poor may persist as it often does even in catastrophe, but scarcity eventually presses on everyone. In crowded urban conditions, disease is always near. The evidence remains incomplete about daily life inside the besieged city, because the voices of ordinary Carthaginians were not preserved, but the pattern of ancient sieges is grimly familiar. Malnutrition weakens bodies. Fear weakens judgment. Rumour moves faster than orders. Every delay becomes both hope and torture. Still, Carthage strikes back. Defenders launch sorties, burn Roman equipment, rebuild damaged sections, and use the complexity of their city to frustrate assault. The harbour remains especially important. When the Romans attempt to block access, the Carthaginians reportedly cut a new channel and send ships out unexpectedly. The image is almost too perfect, a people of the sea carving a path back to water while surrounded by enemies. Scholars still debate details of the episode, but its symbolic truth is powerful. Even at the edge of destruction, Carthage thinks like a maritime city. For Rome, such resistance is infuriating. It confirms every accusation while also exposing the weakness of those accusations. If Carthage can build ships under siege, Roman hawks can say the city was always dangerous. Yet it is dangerous because Rome has forced it into a fight for existence. This circular reasoning is common in wars of annihilation. The victim's resistance becomes proof that annihilation was necessary. The more Carthage fights, the more Rome believes it must not be allowed to survive. Scipio Aemilianus brings the siege toward its final shape. He is disciplined, politically connected, and aware that his task is not merely military. He must succeed where earlier efforts stumbled. He restores order among Roman forces, tightens operations, strengthens the blockade, and treats the city not as an opponent to be frightened, but as a fortress to be methodically consumed. Under his command, Rome becomes less impatient and more dangerous. The siege settles into a logic of constriction. Inside Carthage, leadership grows harsher as circumstances darken. Ancient sources describe internal violence, punishments, and factional desperation, though hostile reporting makes details difficult to trust completely. What is certain is that prolonged siege strains civic unity. Some want endurance at any cost. Some may hope for negotiation. Some may blame leaders who provoked Rome, or those who trusted Rome too long. But the space for political choice has narrowed almost to nothing. Once a city is encircled and marked for destruction, disagreement becomes another form of suffering. There is also the matter of memory. The defenders know, at least in some form, that they stand in the last line of a long history. Behind them are the Phoenician founders, the first harbours, the merchants who sailed west, the armies in Sicily, the Barcid campaigns in Spain, Hannibal crossing the Alps, the years of humiliation, the payments, the disputes, the hostages, the impossible demand to leave the coast. A city is not only buildings, it is accumulated time. Carthage fights with that weight behind its walls. Rome fights with memory too. Roman soldiers under Scipio may not have seen Cannae, but they have inherited its meaning. Their fathers and grandfathers lived in the world Hannibal shook. The siege becomes a ritual of revenge for injuries many participants know only through story. That does not make the violence less real. In some ways, inherited fear can be more durable than personal fear, because it is purified by distance. It loses the confusion of lived experience and becomes a lesson. The final defense of Carthage is often overshadowed by the destruction that follows, but it deserves attention because it complicates the Roman image of a corrupt, cowardly enemy. The city resists with discipline, invention, and endurance. It holds out for roughly 3 years against the greatest power in the Mediterranean. That does not make Carthage innocent of all the violences of empire, nor does it erase its own history of domination. But it reminds us that the people Rome destroyed were not abstractions. They were human beings inside a civilization fighting for its last morning. As the blockade tightens and Roman pressure increases, the city's world shrinks street by street, wall by wall, ration by ration. The sea that once opened outward now glimmers beyond danger. The harbours that once connected Carthage to distant markets become trapped water. Every familiar place is altered by war. The city is still alive, but its life has become a form of resistance. By the end, Carthage is not defeated in one clean stroke. It is worn down, opened, penetrated, and consumed through urban fighting of terrible closeness. Rome must enter the city it had tried to make disappear from a distance. It must fight through the physical reality of the place. Houses, stairs, roofs, courtyards, narrow streets, and the people who refused to surrender them. The war that began as Roman policy becomes hand-to-hand destruction inside a living city. And still for a little longer Carthage does not vanish. It burns, starves, bleeds and breaks, but it does not vanish. That distinction matters. Rome can decide to erase a city from the political map. It can tear down walls, sell survivors, seize land, and rename territory. But disappearance is never instant. It has to move through bodies and stones. It has to pass through the last defenders on rooftops, through the last families hiding in ruined rooms, through the last fires in the streets. Carthage's final resistance is the space between Rome's decision and Rome's completion of it. The fall of Carthage is not a single moment, it is a descent. Roman soldiers do not simply walk into an empty city and declare the old enemy gone. They have to carve their way through it, and the city has to be broken in layers. Walls give way. Outer defences fail. Streets become battlefields. Houses become towers. Roofs become fighting platforms. Fire moves where soldiers cannot. The last Carthage is not the Carthage of merchant fleets and diplomatic councils, but a trapped urban maze of smoke-hunger, splintered beams, falling stones, and people fighting through the places where they once lived ordinary lives. When Scipio Aemilianus finally forces entry, the struggle turns intimate and savage. Ancient accounts describe fighting street by street, with Romans advancing through narrow passages, while defenders resist from houses and upper floors. In such warfare, the distinction between military space and civilian space collapses. A staircase can become a defensive line. A rooftop can become a killing ground. A doorway can hide a last stand. The city's density, once a sign of prosperity, becomes the shape of its agony. Rome must destroy Carthage not as an idea, but room by room. The base of the citadel hill becomes the final centre of resistance. It rises above the city as a place of refuge, command, and last hope. As Roman forces press inward, survivors crowd toward it, carrying with them whatever remains of courage, terror, loyalty, and despair. The evidence remains incomplete, and ancient descriptions are shaped by Roman victory, but the broad image is credible, a collapsing city narrowing toward a final high place. Fires burn below. The harbour is lost. The streets are filled with dead and wounded. The defenders who remain are no longer fighting for victory in any realistic sense. They are fighting because surrender has come too late to feel like salvation. One of the most haunting traditions says that Scipio, watching the city burn, weeps, and reflects on the fall of great cities, fearing that Rome itself may one day face such a fate. Whether the scene happened exactly as later writers present it is uncertain, but its survival is revealing. Even Roman memory needed a moment of shadow at the edge of triumph. The destroyer looks at the destroyed and sees perhaps the future. This does not stop the destruction. It does not save Carthage. But it suggests that at least some Romans understood the terrible symmetry of history. No city is immune to time simply because it has defeated its rival. The destruction is vast. Survivors are enslaved. Buildings are burned, dismantled, or left in ruin. The political existence of Carthage ends. Its territory becomes Roman-controlled, eventually organized as the province of Africa. The old enemy is removed from the map as an independent power. Rome has achieved what Cato demanded. Carthage is not merely defeated, it is unmade. Yet later stories have added layers that must be handled carefully. The most famous is the claim that Romans sowed the ground with salt so nothing would grow there again. This image is powerful, but it is not supported by ancient evidence, and is generally treated by modern historians as a later legend. It feels true to the emotional memory of destruction, but feeling true is not the same as being true. Rome did devastate Carthage, enslave many inhabitants, and end the city's independence. That is severe enough without adding a symbolic ritual that likely never happened. The real violence does not need embellishment. Another complication is that Carthage did not remain empty forever. This is one of history's sharpest ironies. Rome destroys Punic Carthage in 146 BCE, but later Roman power returns to the same site. Julius Caesar plans a colony there, and Augustus completes the project. Roman Carthage eventually becomes one of the great cities of the empire, wealthy and important in its own right. The location is too valuable to abandon permanently. The harbour, the land, the routes, the geography that made Carthage powerful before Rome destroyed it still exist. Rome erases the enemy city, then rebuilds a Roman city on the bones of what it feared. This later rebuilding does not undo the destruction, but it changes how we should understand it. Rome did not destroy Carthage because the site itself was cursed or useless. It destroyed the political and cultural rival that occupied that site. The land was desirable, the harbour was desirable, the agricultural wealth of the region was desirable. What Rome could not tolerate was a Carthaginian power controlling them. This distinction matters. It reveals that fear and appetite stood together. Rome feared Carthage's return, but it also wanted the world Carthage had occupied. For the people taken from the ruined city, the consequences were immediate and personal. Enslavement turns defeat into dispersal. Families are separated. Names disappear from records. Punic speech, religion, and identity do not vanish overnight across North Africa, but the city that gave them imperial focus is gone. Cultural survival becomes fragmented, local, and harder to trace. Archaeology offers objects, inscriptions, burial grounds, walls, pottery, and traces of urban life, but it cannot fully restore the voices lost in the fires. What survives in the records suggests persistence as well as rupture. Punic culture continued in parts of North Africa under Roman rule, but Carthage as a sovereign centre had been broken. Rome's victory sends a message across the Mediterranean. It says that old rivals will not be allowed to remain as proud survivors. It says that Rome's patience has limits, and those limits may end not in tribute or treaty, but in annihilation. Other powers are watching. In the same year, 146 BCE, Rome also destroys Corinth after conflict in Greece. The coincidence is staggering. Two famous cities, one in the west and one in the east, crushed in the same year as Rome asserts a harsher Mediterranean dominance. Scholars still debate how consciously Romans link these events in policy, but as symbols they belong together. The Republic is no longer only defeating enemies, it is demonstrating what resistance can cost. Carthage's unmaking also changes Rome's own moral landscape. The enemy that had justified vigilance is gone. The rival that had sharpened discipline is gone. If Scipio Nasica truly warned that Rome needed Carthage as a counterweight to its own excess, later events give that warning a dark resonance. After Carthage, Rome continues to expand, but internal tensions grow inequality, slave labour, provincial wealth, ambitious commanders, land crises, and political violence. Carthage's destruction does not cause all of this by itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the Roman Republic's later turmoil. But removing the great external enemy leaves Rome facing more clearly the dangers inside its own success. In the ruins, fear has completed its transformation. It began as fear of Carthaginian strength became fear of Hannibal, then fear of recovery, then fear of possibility itself. By 146 BCE, Rome has acted against not only what Carthage was, but what Rome imagined Carthage might become. That imagination proved lethal. The city that once commanded ships across the western Mediterranean is reduced to ash captives and memory. But memory is not obedient. Rome can burn buildings and sell survivors, but it cannot control what Carthage will become in the minds of later generations. To Romans, it becomes a warning about dangerous rivals and the price of survival. To others, it becomes a warning about what great powers do when fear overrules restraint. To archaeologists, it becomes a layered site where destruction, rebuilding, propaganda, and survival lie on top of one another. To history, it becomes one of the clearest examples of a civilization destroyed not because it was attacking at that moment, but because its conqueror could not bear the thought that it might matter again. The city is unmade, but the question remains alive in the ashes. Was Rome defending itself, avenging the past, seizing opportunity, or eliminating a symbol too powerful to tolerate? The answer is not one thing. It is all of them moving together through Senate debates, border disputes, siege works, and burning streets. Carthage falls because Rome wins the war, but Rome destroys Carthage because victory alone no longer feels safe. Rome destroys Carthage because fear has become a habit of government. That does not mean fear is the only motive or even always the most conscious one. Roman leaders also see land wealth, strategic advantage, political glory, and the satisfaction of ending an old rivalry. They understand that North Africa is valuable. They understand that Carthage's harbour and agricultural hinterland matter. They understand that a dramatic victory can strengthen reputations at home. But beneath these calculations lies a deeper Roman lesson, learned through pain. A rival once allowed to recover may return in a form more dangerous than before. This lesson comes from Rome's own experience as much as from Carthage's. Rome is a civilization of recovery. It builds its identity around surviving defeats, raising new armies, absorbing shocks and continuing when other states might negotiate. Because Rome knows the power of endurance in itself, it can imagine endurance in an enemy. Carthage loses Sicily and rebuilds in Spain. Carthage loses Hannibal's war and rebuilds its economy. Carthage is disarmed and still resists for 3 years. To Roman eyes, these are not separate facts. They form a pattern. The enemy is never safe to leave half alive. Yet this pattern is also selective. By the middle of the 2nd century, BCE Carthage is not truly Rome's equal. It lacks the military freedom, naval force, and overseas empire that had once made it a direct strategic rival. Rome's dominance across the Mediterranean has grown enormously. In practical terms, continued containment was possible. Carthage could have remained a wealthy but supervised city useful for trade and taxation. That Rome chooses destruction shows that policy is not made only from present danger. It is made from remembered danger, imagined danger, and the political usefulness of danger. Fear becomes easier to justify when it wears the clothing of law. Carthage has violated the treaty by fighting Massinissa without Roman permission. That fact gives Rome a formal argument, but the treaty itself was written by the victor and enforced through Roman power. It placed Carthage in a position where defending itself could be defined as rebellion. This is one of the oldest patterns in imperial politics. A dominant power creates conditions that limit a weaker state's choices, then treats the weaker state's desperate response as proof of guilt. No single explanation fully accounts for the Third Punic War, unless this structure is understood. Rome is not merely reacting to Carthaginian aggression. It has helped create the crisis it then punishes. There is also the psychology of example. Rome does not want only Carthage to understand Roman power. It wants the entire Mediterranean to understand. The destruction of Carthage tells allies, rivals, kings' leagues, and subject peoples that Roman patience is not weakness, and Roman victory does not always end with survival for the defeated. This message is especially important in a world where Rome is expanding faster than its older republican habits can comfortably contain. Fear travels outward from the ruins. It becomes a diplomatic instrument. At the same time, the destruction speaks inward to Rome itself. Roman politics in the 2nd century BCE is competitive, honor-driven, and increasingly shaped by opportunities for commanders abroad. A final war against Carthage offers prestige, moral clarity, and connection to ancestral memory. To argue for Carthage's destruction is to stand with the dead of Cannae, with the endurance of the ancestors, with the idea that Rome must never again allow such danger to gather. It is difficult for moderation to compete with that emotional force. Restraint can sound like forgetfulness. Mercy can sound like betrayal. Carthage then becomes a symbol larger than its actual power. It is no longer judged only as a city in 149 BCE. It is judged as the heir of every Carthage. Rome has feared the naval power of the First Punic War, the Spain of the Barcids, the Hannibalic army in Italy, the wealthy survivor after Zama, the city that pays too quickly, the city that refuses to leave the sea. Rome compresses a century of anxiety into one object, and then destroys the object. What survives in the record suggests that this symbolic compression was essential. Without Hannibal's shadow, Carthage's later prosperity might not have seemed so threatening. Without prosperity, Hannibal's shadow might have faded. Together they made survival look like danger. The tragedy is that Rome's solution is both effective and false. It is effective because Carthage never again challenges Rome as an independent power. The old rival is gone. North Africa becomes part of Rome's sphere and eventually one of its richest provincial regions. The Western Mediterranean has no comparable counterweight. In the narrow strategic sense, Rome removes a possible threat. But it is false because the removal of Carthage does not remove insecurity from Roman history. Fear simply finds new homes. It moves to Macedonia, Syria, Numidia, the Germanic frontier, Parthia internal conspiracies, slave revolts, ambitious generals and civil wars. The enemy outside the gates is replaced again and again by new forms of danger. This is the deeper warning in the story. A state that defines safety as the absence of rivals can never be safe for long. There is always another rival, another frontier, another possibility. Carthage's destruction gives Rome control, but it also strengthens a habit of total solutions. Once annihilation becomes thinkable as policy, it remains available in the political imagination. Not every Roman war becomes a war of destruction, and Rome is often pragmatic, incorporating defeated peoples rather than erasing them. But Carthage shows what Rome can do when fear, memory, and opportunity align. It also reveals something uncomfortable about historical judgment. Rome's fear was not invented from nothing. Hannibal had nearly broken the Republic. Carthage had been a formidable enemy. The Mediterranean had seen defeated powers recover before. Roman leaders were not fools for remembering danger, but memory becomes dangerous when it refuses to notice change. By the time of the Third Punic War, Rome is fighting not only the Carthage that exists, but the Carthage that once existed, and the Carthage it imagines might exist again. The actual city is trapped between past and possibility. For Carthage, this means there is no acceptable innocence. It cannot be poor enough because poverty might change. It cannot be obedient enough because obedience might hide ambition. It cannot be disarmed enough because weapons can be remade. It cannot be inland enough unless it abandons itself. Rome's fear sets conditions that only disappearance can satisfy. That is why the final demand to leave the coast is so revealing. It is the moment when security and erasure become the same word. Scholars still debate how ordinary Romans understood the destruction. Did they see it as justice, revenge, necessity, or simply the distant work of armies? The evidence remains incomplete. But elite memory shaped the story that survived, and elite memory had its reasons. Rome preferred to see itself as severe because it had to be, not because it wanted to be. That self-image matters. Great powers rarely describe themselves as predators. They describe themselves as guardians of order, even when order arrives with fire. The destruction of Carthage was therefore not an accident of anger. It was the result of a long accumulation geographic rivalry, wars of exhaustion, Hannibalic trauma, economic jealousy, treaty restrictions, Numidian pressure, Roman political rhetoric, and the imperial desire for finality. Remove any one element and perhaps the ending changes. Put them together and the city's survival becomes harder and harder to defend in Roman politics. Fear became policy because it was useful, sincere, inherited, and profitable all at once. It gave Rome a language for ambition that sounded like defense. It turned a weakened city into an intolerable future threat. It allowed Roman leaders to claim that destruction was not cruelty but prudence. And it left behind a question that outlives both republics and empires. When does the memory of danger become more dangerous than the danger itself? Carthage was destroyed because Rome feared it, but also because Rome feared uncertainty. It feared the unknown future in which a rich port might recover a defeated people, might reorganize a name, might gather power again. The flames of 146 BCE were meant to end that uncertainty. Yet the ashes did something Rome could not prevent. They preserved the question. They made Carthage unforgettable, not as a living rival, but as a warning about what happens when victory is no longer enough. Carthage does not disappear after it is destroyed. That is one of the quiet ironies of Rome's victory. The city is burned, its people killed or enslaved. Its independence ended, its political name removed from the map, yet its memory remains too powerful to bury. Rome wanted to end a rival, but it created a symbol. The ruins on the North African coast became proof of Roman severity, a warning to enemies, and over time a mirror in which later ages could see the violence hidden inside the language of security. For Rome, Carthage becomes a completed fear. The old enemy is gone and the Western Mediterranean is open to Roman dominance. North Africa's agricultural wealth eventually feeds Roman power. Roman settlers and officials return to the site because geography still matters more than hatred. The harbour remains valuable, the land remains fertile, the routes remain useful. A Roman Carthage rises where Punic Carthage fell, and this new city becomes prosperous, elegant, and deeply tied to the empire that once swore the place could not be allowed to live. Yet beneath the Roman streets lies another Carthage. Archaeology finds traces of Punic walls, graves, houses, workshops, harbours, inscriptions, and sacred spaces. The evidence remains incomplete, damaged by destruction, later building erosion, and centuries of reuse, but enough survives to contradict the idea of Carthage as merely Rome's enemy. It was a city of farmers, sailors, merchants, priests, children, artisans, soldiers, politicians and families. It was not only Hannibal, it was not only Cato's fear. It was a civilization whose own voice was largely silenced by the people who wrote the surviving story. This is why Carthage still unsettles the imagination. It reminds us that history often reaches us through the language of winners, and winners are rarely neutral narrators. Rome described Carthage as dangerous, greedy, foreign, and morally suspect. Some of that hostility grew from real rivalry. Some of it served political needs. Scholars still debate many details of Carthaginian religion, politics, and society, because so much was filtered through hostile eyes. But the ruins ask a slower question: what would Carthage have said about Rome if more of its own words had survived? The afterlife of Carthage becomes larger than the city itself. To Rome, it is the enemy that had to be destroyed. To later moralists, it is a warning about pride, rivalry, and imperial fear. To modern historians, it is a case study in how security can become indistinguishable from domination. To anyone standing near the old harbours, it is also something simpler, a reminder that even the strongest cities are temporary arrangements of stone, labour, memory, and belief. No single explanation fully accounts for Carthage's destruction. Rome feared it. Rome hated it. Rome envied it. Rome wanted its land. Rome remembered Hannibal. Rome used law, diplomacy, and war to make annihilation appear necessary. All of these truths belong together. Carthage fell because it had once been powerful enough to frighten Rome, and because even weakened power can terrify those who remember being vulnerable. In the end, the ashes did not give Rome perfect safety. They gave Rome control, wealth, and prestige, but not peace from history. Rome itself would later face fires, civil wars, invasions, fragmentation, and transformation. Scipio's reported tears before burning Carthage endure because they recognize something conquest usually tries to hide. Every city that destroys another is also looking dimly at its own possible future, and so Carthage remains. Not as the empire, it was not as the city Rome burned, but as a shadow along the edge of the Mediterranean story. Its harbours are quieter now. Its gods are gone from their temples. Its language survives only in fragments. But its warning is still clear. A civilization can be defeated by armies, but it is truly endangered when its enemies decide that its mere survival is unacceptable. The wind moves differently over ruins. It does not carry the noise of markets as it once did, or the creak of ships or the voices of sailors returning from Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, and the far western sea. It moves over stones that have been broken, buried, rebuilt, and named again by other powers. It passes over the place where Rome tried to end a story, only for the story to become larger in memory than it had been in life. Carthage teaches a hard lesson about fear. Fear can be reasonable at first. It can come from real wounds, real losses, real graves, and real dangers. Rome had reasons to remember Hannibal. It had reasons to distrust easy peace. But fear, when preserved too long, begins to feed on possibility. It stops asking what an enemy is doing and begins punishing what an enemy might someday do. It turns survival into suspicion. It turns recovery into guilt. It turns a city into a threat simply because it still stands. The ruins of Carthage are not only about Rome and Carthage. They are about every civilization that believes it can secure the future by destroying the thing that frightens it. They are about the fragile line between defense and domination, between memory and obsession, between victory and the hunger for finality. Rome won. Carthage fell. Yet the question left behind is not whether Rome was strong. It was. The question is what strength becomes when it can no longer tolerate uncertainty. In the fading light, the old coast still faces the sea. The water that once carried Carthaginian ships still moves under the same sky. Empires come to it with flags, fleets, laws, gods, and slogans, and then they vanish into layers of earth. What remains is quieter, a harbour, a hill, broken foundations, and the thought that even ashes can remember.